Hello and welcome to Roundtable. Germany had planned to end its use of fossil fuels by the end of the decade, but Berlin has made a U-turn and now plans to fire up coal-fired power plants as Russia cuts supplies. Prices are already at record highs in Europe, and there could well be a recession in Germany. So will going back on international commitments to slash emissions save the economy? Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. The German government has called on its people to cut back on their energy use as the Russian gas giant Gazprom slashes supplies running through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. With Russia set to shut down the pipeline anyway, temporarily for maintenance this week, analysts are worried that President Putin may not turn the pipeline back on in retaliation for the West's support for Ukraine. The head of the German Federation of Trade Unions, Yasmin Fahimi, has said that Russian gas cuts could lead, as she puts it, to entire industries collapsing permanently and massive consequences for the entire economy and jobs in Germany. So, as Germany rushes to fill its gas storage facilities, how prepared is Germany to go without Putin's energy? Well, let us go to Germany, to Berlin, in fact, and Janis Kluger's there, Senior Associate at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in London. Karol Nackli, Chief Exec of Crystal Energy, that's an energy consultancy company, with me in the studio. Leon Izbeki, European natural gas analyst. And you all have connections with Germany. We will get to that in just a little while. Leon, I want to ask you, first of all, how ready is Germany for this switch over, this switch back, if you like?
Well, I mean, it's setting the groundwork. We're looking at a situation in which, on the 8th of July, the upper legislative chamber of Germany is going to have the final vote on the piece of legislation that will enable Germany to reactivate those idled hard coal and lignite-fired power plants. But the question more generally is, how ready is Germany really for the potential scenarios over winter with respect to Russian supplies and Russian gas supplies?
Will it have enough coal power available by then?
Well, so when we look at the situation, the coal and lignite that Germany is bringing back and the overall capacity will still not be enough to actually compensate for example, a full flow halt of Russian gas, or even in a situation in which Russia continues to curtail flows via Nord Stream 1 over the entirety of winter, you are still getting into a situation in which rationing may actually be needed in order to guarantee that there is sufficient supply for protected end consumers, such as private households, or district heating systems and hospitals.
You are from the north of Germany. You are from the Hamburg area. Nuclear power up there has been shut down. Should it come back on? We'll talk about that in a moment. But here are some facts and figures. Payments to Russia for fossil fuels by EU countries since the Russia-Ukraine conflict began, nearly $67 billion. And that includes $2.2 billion for coal. We'll talk about how much coal is coming in from Russia in a moment. Germany has paid Russia $9.2 billion of that $67 billion. Last year, Germany paying $101 billion in imports of oil, coal and gas from Russia, but it has reduced its gas imports from Russia from 55% to 35% since the conflict began. Carol, how hypocritical does it seem of Germany, even in this extreme case, to be going back on its pledges to be totally green by the end of this decade, having said that it would bring that forward from 2035 to 2030. That's gone, hasn't it?
Well, to be fair, it's not just Germany, because if you look at, for example, other countries across the European Union and also Europe more generally and outside this region, you can see that, I don't want to call it a U-turn, but I want to say a pause, actually, with respect to the aggressive climate change policies that were announced a few years ago, because at the moment they are dealing with a severe crisis, and renewable energy is not going to save the day, whether in Germany or elsewhere. And we saw already actually last year, even in Germany on one day of the year where we expected to see the biggest production of electricity from wind, the wind did not blow. So you always need to have a backup under existing technology. And today you have this major crisis. You have the largest economy in the EU, which is also the biggest, the most country that is exposed to Russia because of the consumption of energy coming from Russia. So you have a situation of crisis, and you either say, you know what, everybody should freeze to death because we need to stick to our climate change policy, or you take a more pragmatic approach and try to say, okay, what can we do at the moment, like a short-term measures to get over this crisis while we build enough ammunition to be free from Russian threats to our economy and to the rest of the region.
But it does mean that the green agenda is right out the window, doesn't it?
I think it has been paused rather than being thrown out of the window. And actually, if you look at the EU Repower publication, which came out in May this year, they do place great emphasis on speeding up investment in renewable, but they acknowledge that they also need to build infrastructure for natural gas and maybe stick to coal a little bit longer and even nuclear a little bit longer than expected. So they did not really throw out renewable energy, but they gave fossil fuel, conventional fuel, greater attention than what we saw before the crisis.
Yanis, does this not expose how wrong Germany was in the past to become so dependent on Russia for its energy needs?
I think it's clear now to everybody that this was a mistake. But I would like to circle back, towards the hypocritical part of German energy policy. I would say that right now, the war, it is a big tragedy, and the consequences are huge. But at the same time, if you look out towards the next 10 years, it is clear that this will actually accelerate the green agenda and not decelerate it. So we have now a crisis of 1 or 2 years where we need to turn to coal for electricity production. But this crisis, this war, and also the tensions now with Russia, there is no bigger boost for the green agenda that one could think of than what is happening right now, even though it might seem
no bigger boost for the green agenda than to light up the coal-fired power stations.
Well, this is the snapshot from today, but we have to look out a few years longer than that. And what we're seeing right now is, on the one hand, extremely high energy prices. This is good for conserving energy, for making the economy less energy intensive. This is a major goal in the green agenda. And also what has been exposed is the danger of these dependencies from fossil fuels that are imported from abroad. And if you look at all EU countries, you will see that the buildup of green energy is actually accelerating right now, because it's clear this is the only energy that you can rely on, where you don't have to make these kind of moral compromises by dealing with unsavory regimes all over the world to secure your energy supply.
Back to you, Carol, very quickly, if I may. No compromises. Green energy is still there. It's going to be accelerated. And you said a short while ago you can't rely on it.
Because you have the limitation of technology today and the intermittency of renewable energy. If renewable energy was a solution to the current crisis, to replacing fossil fuels, I've seen everybody using it. But you do have the plain fact that when the sun is not shining or the wind is not blowing, you need to have backup coming from either coal, gas, or nuclear energy. So it's just, I'm setting a plain fact. But what we're seeing today is a realization, an acceptance, public acceptance at least, by various policymakers in Europe and elsewhere, that you cannot achieve climate security without energy security. So in the last few years, climate security took priority and really hardly anyone thought about energy security. But today we see this kind of rebalancing, quite rightly, in my opinion, of these two important priorities. You cannot achieve climate security without energy security.
Leon, do you think this is the Green Coalition's worst nightmare, that it was coal-fired power stations that got fired up, rather than the nuclear power stations, which they wanted closed down and have effectively been closed down? Would that not have been the least worst option?
Well, I think it's really, the leadership in Germany, in particular the Green Party, has exhibited a lot of pragmatism when it comes to trying to reconcile longer-term aims with respect to climate neutrality and climate protection and as my fellow panelists have highlighted, the shorter term goals of actually
But that's throwing
securing
your
energy
ideals
security.
out of the window again. I apologise for using the phrase a second time, but effectively that's what it is. It's saying we've got to deal with today. Well, we can't have proper beliefs like we had before.
Well, I think, like while in the short term you might have that discrepancy between those two goals, in the long term they're not incompatible with one another, right? I mean, yes, you are looking at increasing coal-fired power plant output. You're looking at potentially bringing back nuclear power plants in the short term. But as Yanis in particular was highlighting, in the long run, what this really means is that the push towards greener energy is being accelerated across the EU because it is the only source of energy that you can actually rely on without simultaneously exposing yourself to political risks geopolitically.
Yeah, because you don't have to import the sun
Pretty
or
much,
the wind
exactly.
or whatever it happens to be. You talk about going back to nuclear energy just about 30 seconds ago. Germany has ditched nuclear energy. France, on the other hand, has expanded its nuclear energy program. Where does Germany stand on this? Could they fire up those reactors again?
So you still have 3 active reactors in Germany that have around 4.1 gigs of capacity, and they are expected to shut down by the end of this year. So the conversation in Germany is really about potentially prolonging and extending the life of those remaining power plants. So we have essentially seen even Robert Habeck clearly stating that
You better
from
say who he is.
the German Minister for Economic Affairs and Climate Action.
Green Party.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He essentially made a statement whereby he said that from a technical perspective, it would be feasible to essentially leave them running until newer fuel rods can be ordered so that you can ramp up nuclear output again.
Okay, Germany's Nuclear Power Association. I'll come to you, Yanis, on this one if I may, but it could be that Carol wants to say something. The Nuclear Power Association disagreed publicly with Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, who's continuing to want to shut down nuclear power. And this organisation argues that the plants can be saved, but that the longer Scholz waits to extend their lifespan, the more difficult that will be. What is the position at the moment of the German government on getting these nuclear reactors up, not just for the short term, but for the longer term too?
I think that nobody actually has the intention to really open this discussion again. As you know, there was the exit from nuclear power, then the exit was paused, and then the exit was resumed, and it's a painful topic. And I think that there's enough, stuff that creates tensions in this governing coalition, and nobody wants to, tackle on the next issue there, especially because it's a bit dubious or questionable what it would actually help in this particular crisis, because as my co-panelist just now said, it's about a very small amount of energy compared to Germany's total consumption. And on the other hand, we also have to consider that it's usually not as flexible as gas-fired power plants. So this is why we turn to coal, because we can fire it up and down much more quickly than nuclear power plants. And this is what we need, this intermittent energy to compensate for the shortfall of wind and sun when it's not active. And nuclear power, well, it's not really good at that. It is a very small amount now in the German energy mix. And the amount which would be salvageable is also small. So it's basically, to me, it's more of an ideological discussion. It was a big discussion in the past, but now if we look at the contribution that could come from nuclear energy realistically in the next 2 years, it is so small that it's basically, from my perspective, not really worth it. And this is what I think also the perspective of Mr. Habeck, for example, is at the moment.
Well, perhaps, Carol, a big mistake if it is an ideological argument and nobody's going to want to go back on this one, because as we mentioned earlier, France is going full nuclear. Germany is very, very reluctantly to go even a fraction nuclear and is prepared instead to open up the coal-fired power plants. But the economic cost of that to Germany could be such that France will be able to say, look, we've escaped relatively well in this crisis in terms of our energy. And that would position France, if you like, as the economic leader of the new Europe.
Not necessarily, but first let me highlight an important point because I heard it from my both co-speakers. That is, when you have renewable energy, when you use more renewable energy, then you're less exposed to energy security issues and supplies coming from other countries because you produce the sun that is shining on top of your country and you use the wind that is blowing in your forest and garden. That is true up to a point because you still need metals and minerals that are coming from abroad to produce solar panels and to produce the wind turbines. And if you look across the world where those metals and minerals are concentrated, they are actually very few countries can be classified as reliable suppliers. Many of those countries, they have problems with institutional frameworks, they have a huge corruption, they don't have really friendly government to the West in particular. So we have to be careful when we are saying that we want to move away from imports from Russian gas and therefore focus on green energy because that is homegrown. That is, in my opinion, misconception. Now to go back to, yeah, go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to ask you another question, but I'd forgotten I'd already asked you one and you'd gone off somewhere else. So go back to where you wanted to.
Yeah, no, I just had to highlight that issue about the issue of homegrown renewable energy. But with respect to nuclear energy, I mean, it is true. If you look at globally, the contribution of nuclear power to global electricity generation, that has peaked in the 1990s. And since then, nuclear power has not been able to go back to its heydays of the 1990s for several reasons: economic reasons, technical challenges, security issues, you name it. And therefore, I don't think the current crisis is going to revive, if you want, nuclear power because it is a very controversial source of energy. You have to think about not only the terms of cost and technical, but think about the waste, think about the perception of safety. So it may be a short-term solution just to prolong the life of existing nuclear power plants, but it doesn't mean that everybody else is going to rush to build nuclear power plants because of this long series or cocktail of challenges facing nuclear power.
Shall we hear now from the EU Commission President and the German Chancellor on this controversial issue of firing up these coal-fired power plants?
There will not be a return to cheap fossil fuels, I think, and therefore, alongside temporary and targeted support to vulnerable families and businesses, it is essential to help our economies and societies to adapt to the new conditions.
Germany's been dependent on Russian energy supplies for too long and too unilaterally. Today, we have to realize that Russia is using energy as a weapon. No one believes that Russia is reducing its gas deliveries for technical reasons only. That's why it's important now to reduce the dependency on Russian energy imports as quickly as possible, without jeopardizing our energy security.
So, Leon, I have this vision, not just of Germany, but of large industrial countries across Europe suddenly belching out filthy smoke and a return to the old days of massive pollution.
Well, I mean, it's not really about industrial on-site power generation. It is about, large-scale power generation for utilities to supply enough power into the grid to essentially decrease the amount of gas that we are burning in not only the German balance and within Germany, but across Europe.
But these power plants belch out smoke, as well as steam. I
Yes.
mean, it's steam we see here, but they burn coal, they make smoke.
No, absolutely. And this is also something where, we have seen this presenting a technical limitation to potentially bringing back some lignite-fired power plants where, they haven't installed the filters necessary to essentially meet emission standards if they would be running for base load, so at a very high load factor over the course of an entire year, which has also sparked debate within the German government whether there might be a staggered approach to first bringing back actually hard coal-fired power plants and then later lignite.
Are you able to comment on other European countries and what their attitude to this is and whether this will add to overall European pollution issues?
Well, I think just more generally speaking, when you look at the European landscape, the largest amount of spare coal and lignite-fired capacity that you have is in Germany. So that's ultimately the largest amount of switchable capacity and additional capacity that you may have. You are seeing a lot of other coal-fired power plants revamping, having overall higher load factors, higher utilization rates across Europe. That is, for example, in Spain. It is also across the board in other remaining countries where they do have remaining coal-fired capacity online. But the vast majority of it is in Germany, because a lot of the other Eastern European countries in particular are essentially relying on coal anyways. There's not so much fuel switching taking place.
Well, this is where I wanted to go. Yanis, I'll come to you. It may not be your field, but I mean, it doesn't matter because we can kick the ideas around. I was thinking of Poland. You were talking about Eastern European countries. I was thinking of Poland, that was criticised for saying it wanted to remain with its coal-fired power station. Other Eastern European countries too. Will this not give them more of a moral authority to say, when this situation is over, why should we bother going green when, in fact, you've been doing this, you've been criticising us for doing it in the past?
I think what it shows is that there needs to be a backup plan, and that the dependencies, by the way, which also exist with nuclear power, I mean, it also has fuel that needs to come from somewhere, that these dependencies need to be hedged, and they need to be thought through so that this situation is not repeated. Still, again, I think what we will see, especially in Germany in the next years, is a much faster buildup of wind and solar power generation. And so I think that Germany could even be a positive example for a neighbor like Poland.
Excuse me for saying this, but that is a point you've already made. My question to you is, isn't this a bad example to those countries that have been criticised in the past for belching out smoke from their coal-fired power stations, and therefore we'll be able to say, why should we go green? You haven't.
Well, again, as I said, it is true right now, but I think it is also clear to everybody that this is not a choice that we make easily, and it's not a choice that we like, but it's a choice that is related to just necessity and energy security. If we have a choice in the medium and long term, we do have a choice. We will make a different choice. We will make a choice against coal, and we hope that this will be also sort of more of inspiration also to our neighbors. But again, also what happens in Brussels and their sort of influence on the energy supply in Europe plays a big role as well.
You are all going to be directly affected by this because you have family connections in Germany. You are there at the moment in Berlin. Yanis, I'll start with you. What effect do you think rationing will have if and when it comes in? Well, if Germans have already been advised to cut back on their uses, but rationing is a different thing where you're told.
Right. So we already feel the consequences because our energy bills are going up immensely. I think that most of Germans actually have their energy bills doubling right now, and for families makes a huge difference. So there are support programs from the state, but still it is being felt, although with a delay, but it's already felt now. We are still away from rationing, and rationing would first affect industry. And not private households. So I mean, the point that certain households cannot use more than X amount of energy or gas, I think it is rather unlikely to happen. But you cannot exclude it. And of course, I think that the government needs to create the perception for this reality. It is a crisis, and everybody needs to go in crisis mode and treat this accordingly. Otherwise, it will not be enough because people need to change their behaviors. And, ideally, they need to do that without rationing, without, the supply of gas being limited. But again, I mean, we are several steps away from that. First will be electricity production, then it will be industrial use of energy, and then maybe in the end there will be some limits, but I still don't see it coming at this point.
Okay, Carol, I have to ask you, because we're running out of time. You've got family connections in the Black Forest area of Germany. How would rationing hurt you?
Well, I mean, first of all, we have to be careful what rationing is and what it involves. But let me tell you what we did personally in our very old house in the Black Forest. That's what we did last year. We used to run all the heaters in every single room, and that was not enough. So what we did last year, we invested in insulating the windows. And after that, we realized that when you put maybe 1 or 2 heaters, the whole house was warm. And the point here is that, people underestimate, I'm an economist, I think like an economist, but people tend to underestimate the power of the price signal that will lead consumers and households to adjust their behavior and find, a solution. It's not just only about cutting consumption because there are not enough supplies, but also you have to think about improving efficiency because that is also a long-term benefit. And that's what we did. And that's why I'm not really worried about this winter.
Okay, Leon, Hamburg is your family area. You've spoken to people back there. Are they as happy to do things, well, if not happy, prepared to do things, as we've heard from Yanis and Carol?
I think there is certainly an effort going on within the population more generally to try and cut back on energy consumption more generally, and price signals have definitely helped. But I think it's important to highlight at this stage that if we are looking at a scenario in which we are going to have no flows from Russia in terms of gas, you are looking at prices that are increasing 4, 5, 6 times from the levels that we are seeing now in order to actually try and trigger the amount of reduction in demand in the very short term over winter to try and balance the market. And the question is just going to be for politicians more generally, is that acceptable, or will we have to step in to mandate and to manage the market ourselves to actually start rationing?
It all dovetails, doesn't it? It's all very complicated. Listen, thank you very, very much indeed. Going green, it isn't impossible in the current climate, but the answer right now appears to be black. For me, David Foster and the Roundtable team, hope to have your company next time.